Hi everyone. Hi. Welcome. My name is Johanne. I am the project coordinator of the Knowledge Network for Women who are living with HIV, Kunskapsnätverk för kvinnor som lever med HIV. With me I have the project group, which consists of Lina, Paula and Jane. And the Knowledge Network, we strive to increase knowledge in the target group, women who are living with HIV, and also to the society in general. And we do this as part of an empowerment for the individual and also to decrease stigma in society. Today I have the honor to introduce Naina Khanna, who has traveled all the way from California to visit us. She is the executive director of Positive Women's Network in the United States. And she has a tremendous amount of experience from the field, among others as a speaker, trainer, activist, and advisory counselor to President Obama. Today she's here to talk about women and HIV from a feminist and anti-racist perspective, which we think is called for in the Swedish context. So just a bit of practical information. We will start with Naina's presentation. And then we'll have a small moderated part, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. And then at 3:30 we will serve fika and coffee out there, so it's going to the right and then to the right again. So without further ado, I think I will let Naina present herself and the topics, and welcome.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm Naina Khanna, as Johanna said. I come to this work as a woman living with HIV, and I'm also the executive director of Positive Women's Network, which I will talk about in a little bit. But before I get started, I'd love to just hear from a couple of y'all about why you were interested in coming to this talk today. So, anyone? Yes?
Well, I work with a lot of parents and families living with HIV, so I'm really interested to hear about those perspectives and what they look at in the area.
Great, thank you so much. Anyone else? Yes.
I work with an organization of Africans who live with HIV, and I'm interested to hear and exchange knowledge about USA and Sweden.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear everything? Okay, do you mind repeating that a little bit louder?
Okay. Okay. I said I came here to listen to the exchange of knowledge between USA and Sweden for people living with HIV.
Great. Okay, awesome. Maybe one more? No? Okay, no pressure. Great. So, I come from a popular education model where we believe the wisdom is in the room. So I love the name of your program, Knowledge Exchange, because I think that there's we all have so much to learn from each other by listening. And so let me just tell you a little bit about who we are. So I'm going to talk about Positive Women's Network, who we are and what we do. I'm going to talk about the context we're working in, and then I'm going to talk specifically about some of our work. And please feel free to, just let me know if you have questions along the way. We'll also have time for a sort of moderated discussion and questions, but if anything is unclear or if you want me to explain anything, just let me know while I'm talking. This is not formal. So, Positive Women's Network USA is the only national organization in the US led by and for women and people of trans experience living with HIV. We were founded in 2008. By 28 really diverse women and folks of trans experience living with HIV. So we've been around for about 11 years now. Before that, there was no national organized voice for women with HIV in the US. And today we have over 3,000 members nationally. We don't know exactly actually how many we have. It may be more than this, but because of disclosure and confidentiality reasons, we actually don't know who all of our members are. But we have organizers on the ground who know who the folks are in their area. We also have chapters. So in the US, you probably know this, but I'll just state the obvious. So we have 50 states. We also have a couple of territories. So we have formal chapters in 6 of those states right now. And then in another 12 states, we have what's called state leads, which are sort of like field organizers between our members in those areas and our national network. And so we basically have an organized, mobilized presence in about 18 to 20 states right now, where we can activate people to take action on issues. We hear from them about issues that are going on the ground so that we can respond together. And so all of our chapters are led by women and people of trans experience living with HIV. 100% of our state leads are women and people of trans experience living with HIV. That's all of the leaders in our organization are reflective of our membership and constituency. And so our mission is to prepare and involve our community, right, in all of our diversity in policy and decision making. And so we do not provide direct services, other than we provide services in terms of, we do a lot of leadership development, political education, and things like that. But primarily what we do is advocacy, and we organize. So why did we create a national network? Well, if you're familiar with both the epidemic in the US and sort of like the discourse around the epidemic in the US, like the films that come out about the early days of the epidemic, and about the activist response, what do you see? Anyone seen women in those movies? But we've been there fighting since the beginning. You know, women, trans people, people of color have been part of the domestic HIV response since the very beginning. And in fact, we're all, not only as allies and partners and family members, but as people living with HIV also. And so, but yet, despite the fact that women have been impacted by HIV since the very beginning, for a range of reasons, we have not been effectively represented at the highest levels where decisions are made about programs that impact our lives, about policies that impact our lives, about the research pipeline, etc. And so basically we were founded to change that. Another thing we also saw was when we did look at who was representing and speaking for women with HIV in the US, most of the time it wasn't women with HIV at all. But when it was a handful of white middle-class women who really didn't reflect what our epidemic looks like. So we have increasingly become, over the last 35, 40 years, an epidemic that is increasingly racialized, increasingly impoverished, and where HIV is really impacting people of all genders who are low income, Black and brown folks, and marginalized by multiple forms of discrimination. And so we were really founded to build power among those communities most impacted by the epidemic and least represented in discourse and decision making. And so some of the images you see here are, from the early days. This one at the top here, Fighting for Our Lives. Does anybody know where that image is from? This is the first time people living with HIV stormed the stage at an LGBT conference in Denver. And it was people living with HIV and some allies who came and said, we demand rights and we demand representation. And something came out of that called the Denver Principles, which is where the principle of meaningful involvement or greater involvement of people with HIV comes from, is sort of from that original document that talked about, as people living with HIV, we have the right to, decide what our healthcare looks like. We have the right to be consulted by researchers about what the pipeline is going to look like, et cetera. But even in this image, you can see this is basically cisgender men, mostly white, who took the stage at that conference. And so women had to fight even to be recognized as having opportunistic infections that resulted from an HIV diagnosis. So until the mid-1990s, even though women were getting HIV, we literally said women don't get AIDS, they just die from it, because the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention did not define, for example, cervical cancer as an AIDS-defining condition. What that meant was that women with HIV who had these conditions didn't qualify for access to services that men with HIV qualified for. And so, basically, since the very beginning of the epidemic, women have been kind of like fighting just to be seen and just to be visible. And so, starting in 2007, a bunch of us came together and said, this is not working. Basically, we need to change this. And so we decided to build a more diverse, accountable pipeline of women living with HIV who were prepared and equipped to be in decision-making spaces at tables in meaningful ways and supported to be there. And to also organize ourselves with a collective voice and collective demands. And so who are we today? So that was 28, women and trans folks sitting in a room, basically for about 3 or 4 days, getting really clear about our values, our principles, how we're going to work together, our shared struggles, our stories. Today we've grown to this national membership body with representation across the country. In addition to our members, so our members are any person living with HIV who identifies as a PWN member. So self-identified women, trans and gender non-conforming folks, non-binary folks are all part of our community. Trans folks are part of our community. But they're not the only people we touch and reach and mobilize. And so from an organizing perspective, we really look at our base. So our accomplices and our allies are people who consistently throw down with us in various ways. So that includes a lot of different folks, right? Some of them are our family members, our community members, people who identify as men living with HIV, but also people who don't have anything to do with HIV, who are like reproductive justice focused or working on protecting some aspects of the social safety net, which is basically like our welfare system for low-income people and people living with HIV. So we count all of those people in our base. If they show up for us consistently, they're part of our base, right? And if we show up for them consistently, we're in their base. So we are a base-building organization that is led by and for women and people of trans experience living with HIV, but many other folks have found a political home with us. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So who's a member? I just sort of talked about this, but any self-identified woman, person of trans experience, non-binary person, or gender non-conforming person living with HIV who chooses to identify. We do not require folks to have to be out about their HIV status in order to participate. We do not require people to be, kind of front and center in advocacy in order to be able to participate. And this is really important. I'm sure folks in this room know that that's really important because of stigma and violence and lots of other factors that people living with HIV face. It's not always safe to be out and involved and out front or to even disclose your status publicly. So we work hard to sort of create the context and containers for people to be meaningfully involved in advocating regardless of their disclosure level. The only thing they have to do is tell us, that we have lots of different ways they can tell us. So this is our national presence. Although one of my staff just told me that this is an old map and I need to update it because we have 2 more states we're in now. But the purple states here are basically where we have a state lead, which is what I talked about earlier. The blue states are where we have a chapter, which is a more kind of robust, organized presence that works on state-level advocacy issues as well, on state-level campaigns. And then the light blue states are where we have a strong membership base. The gray ones are where we don't really have a base yet. So it is very important to us that our leadership reflects our constituency. And so we have a mandate that our executive director will always be a woman living with HIV, a woman or trans person living with HIV. The majority of our staff will always be people living with HIV and majority people of color. Our board of directors is 100% women and people of trans experience living with HIV. And so here you can see our board members, including our officers. And this is just a picture of our PWN staff. So you have a sense of who we are. So right now there are 9 of us, but there are usually 10. We're going through one position transition in our organizing director. So the way we work is our approach is grounded in racial justice, gender justice, economic justice. It's really intersectional. We center impacted communities. What that means is we prioritize whichever community is going to be most impacted by a particular decision or proposal when we create our position on that position or proposal. So, for example, we wouldn't have a situation or endorse a situation where, a bunch of cisgender folks are making decisions about a trans-centered policy proposal, right? We would really make sure that we have some sort of mechanism within our organization to convene our trans members, to take input from our from allied organizations and partners we work with that are trans-led as we develop our position. Right, and it would always be vetted with leadership from those communities that will be most impacted by the issues. And we are focused on both changing the balance of power and I would say building power as a community. And so this photo here is one of our founding members, Wahida Shabazz El. If any of you were at the International AIDS Conference in Vienna, she delivered the closing plenary in 2010, basically inviting folks to the International AIDS Conference in DC, which was going to be 2 years later. So what do we actually do? These four things in the middle here are what we basically do. We build leadership, we mobilize advocates through issue-based and electoral organizing. Electoral means we also work on elections. That's a more recent development. You can probably imagine the political context is such now that it demands that we work on elections if we care about policy and if we care about human rights. So we also work to change policy, and we work to eliminate stigma. And we do these things in lots of different ways. So for example, working to eliminate stigma is both through kind of narrative change work, or you might have seen on your seats, I had these like preferred language palm cards that we recently produced that we're disseminating to providers that are really pushing back on how people get talked about, people living with HIV. But we also reframe narratives in media. So we work a lot to position those with lived experience as experts in media and in communications, and to really make sure that their perspectives are centered. So the context we're working in, this is just a little bit of data for you all. So what does our epidemic look like? There are about 1.1 million people living with HIV in the US today. You all, I think, are the first country to get to 90. Congratulations. We are nowhere close to that. We have a lot of work to do. And that is very much about political will, primarily in the US, and the influence of capitalism on our system. But so this is what our new HIV diagnoses look like in the most recent year that has data available. So you can see, I don't know how well you can read this, but the first line up there, that's almost 2,000 new HIV diagnoses in 2017, is Black men who have sex with men, all the way down to this lowest number, which is white women who acquired HIV heterosexually. And so this total number, I think, is somewhere around 38,000 or something. I don't remember exactly, but that's sort of where we tend to be running, is around that number. Black and Latinx men who have sex with men are continuing to be most impacted as far as new diagnoses go in the US. But among women, you also can see that there are severe racial disparities. Black and Latinx women in particular, these absolute numbers are high, but when you look at how it maps on to the actual population, Black women are about 13% of the population of women in the US, but are wildly overrepresented in our data, right? And similarly with Latinx women, who are more like 16 or 17% of the general population, and about 19 or 20% of new diagnoses among women in the US. We do not have good data on people of trans experience because CDC has consistently failed to implement the data collection process that the community has been asking for, which is a two-step gender identification process. We are still talking to them about that. So in addition to diagnosis, there are also disparities in health outcomes, and some are by gender and some are by race, and I'll show you a little bit of both. So women tend to be more linked to care and engaged and retained in care overall than men. Here you can see that the numbers actually are pretty similar among women and men, but where we see a drop-off is in viral suppression. So women, and I'm talking about cisgender women here because, again, the data is not complete on trans women. Cisgender women are less likely to be virally suppressed than cisgender men. So the 59% of women as opposed to 62% of men are virally suppressed. And so, again, there are multiple reasons for this. Some of them are structural around, a lot of them are structural around healthcare access and who the women are. Women tend to be blacker and browner, lower income, and living with lots of different comorbidities and also forms of structural oppression. But also, we have a lot of racism in our healthcare system itself. And so there are many instances where, not just in the HIV arena, but where it's consistently obvious that Black people and Black women in particular are underprescribed when they should be prescribed medication. And I don't know if you heard the saw the story a few months ago about Serena Williams and her experience in childbirth and labor. Even Serena Williams, probably like one of the most powerful Black women in the U.S., had a terrible experience with doctors not believing what she was telling them, right? And so we have a legacy of real racism and misogyny that plays out in our healthcare system, and that impacts people living with HIV, of course. And so, again, this is showing among women the racial disparities in new diagnosis. And so you can see here that Black women were 59% of new diagnoses in 2017, although, as I said, they're 13% of the population, so it's about 5 times higher than it should be. And Hispanic and Latinx women are kind of tracking around their percentage of the population, and white women are underrepresented in terms of diagnoses. And then by transmission category, these categories are also a problem. I don't know if you have this problem here, but we have a problem where a lot of times when a woman says she doesn't know how she got HIV, for a long time we have been put into this category called no identified risk, and that data has started to be cleaned up, but we're not really clear how well it's being cleaned up by CDC. And then this is just sort of showing HIV care continuum outcomes, which is diagnosis, receiving care, retained in care, and viral suppression. And you can see some of the racial disparity data here as well. In particular, I think something to note is that our indigenous people in the US, so Native American, First Nation people, tend to have really poor health outcomes because of their communities have been systematically destroyed and devastated since the US was colonized. And so that has included their own community safety net. It plays out in terms of investment into the healthcare, education, and other forms of infrastructure in those communities as well. So what are we doing about it? Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So when PWN was first founded, I just told you it was 2008. Specifically, it was June of 2008 when we came together for our founding meeting. Anyone know what was happening in the US in the summer of 2008? Just a guess. Anyone? I hear some whispers. Just take a guess. No? Okay, we were in the middle of a really big election here. That was the year that we were in a historic election year, right? So in November of 2008, we elected President Obama. It was a very different time. So there was a lot happening at that time. One of the things that was happening is that the HIV community was pushing for a commitment from presidential candidates. So we use elections a lot as an organizing moment to elevate policy issues. And so the HIV community basically started pushing in 2007, demanding that any major presidential candidates sign on and endorse a call for a national HIV/AIDS strategy. We didn't have one. For many years, the US had been requiring other countries, since the Bush years, since PEPFAR, we had been requiring other countries that we funded to have a domestic strategy, right, to address their HIV epidemic in order to receive PEPFAR funding. But we didn't have our own because, US exceptionalism and imperialism. And it's more important for us to export our values and ideology and agenda around the world than it is to actually, live by the commitments that we're asking other countries to make. So there was a very big organized push for this strategy happening in the US. But the folks who were working on that push, there were no women living with HIV organizations represented. In fact, on the steering committee, that was the Coalition for the National HIV/AIDS Strategy, the initial steering committee, there were almost no people of color. And there was, I think, 2 people living with HIV, and they were both cisgender men. And so, so obviously that was not cool. So we put out a statement, kind of as we were forming, we put out this public statement and we said a national HIV/AIDS strategy without women, not okay. And it was the first time that a group of we hadn't really collaborated together, but it was individuals who had some name recognition, right? Who all signed on to this statement and put it out. And so we basically demanded inclusion into the community coalition. And then we started to get involved in the call for a national HIV/AIDS strategy. We actually started to get involved in 2007 and sort of stepped it up in 2008 as we were coming together. We also heard that people were producing these documents, right? Like these large organizations with like policy staff and lobbying staff and stuff were producing recommendations for the incoming administration. We didn't know who the administration was going to be yet, but folks are putting together recommendations to submit to the. We have in the U.S. the way it works is the election happens in November, a presidential election. Then the president doesn't take power until mid-January, basically. So during that time, they have what's called a transition team. And that transition team is basically like developing a lot of the agenda that wasn't developed, fleshing out platforms, deciding who they're going to consult with, thinking about who they're going to be bringing into their cabinet and their administration, what their priorities are going to look like, and who's informing those. And so we heard that all of these different entities were putting these documents together, and we were like, well, we need one. Nobody's submitting anything on women. So, there was somebody submitting something sort of like general on HIV, something on LGBT communities. There was something for Black Americans and HIV, but nobody was working on women. So we wrote a document. We wrote our own policy document. It wasn't very good, but it was okay. It was like 28 pages long. It was written literally over thousands of hours of volunteer time over the phone. We didn't have Zoom back then. I forget what we were using, some sort of like webinar service. We were like writing this by committee, using like Google Docs and other tools, putting this document together that we then submitted to the transition team. It was a decent document, but it was the first time ever that a policy document written entirely by women living with HIV had been submitted to an incoming administration. And so what ended up happening was we submitted it, right after the election, we submitted it to the Obama-Biden transition team. And subsequently, we were invited onto a phone call so they started doing sort of informational calls with key communities, in November, basically, after the election. And so we were invited as one of the organizations to participate in these calls and to help inform at that time it was their LGBT agenda. And we were like, well, the first thing you need to do is like create an HIV office that is separate from LGBT, right? That is more overarching and more inclusive and where issues don't get sort of like subsumed into LGBT policy that is also important, but HIV policy deserves its own space. So we submitted that in November 2008, and because Obama and actually McCain also had committed to a national HIV/AIDS strategy, we wanted to make sure that our priorities were part of that, whatever strategy they were creating. So also, about a year later, in July 2009, we released another document. And we realized that we needed to be working in coalition with a lot of other women and HIV-focused organizations. So we wrote another document. The administration was talking quite a bit about healthcare and about creating a national healthcare system. And so we broadened our lens and put together a document that addressed both HIV policy issues and healthcare policy issues, and submitted that as a large coalition of organizations to the at that, they had just named their first director of Office of National AIDS Policy in July of 2009, and so we submitted it and presented it to him at his office for consideration. The first national HIV/AIDS strategy that came out under the Obama administration was released in July of 2010. Before that, we also had a major piece of legislation passed called the Affordable Care Act, which is basically the Obama administration's attempt to expand healthcare to everyone, because we don't have universal healthcare. We still don't have universal healthcare. But it was a huge expansion of medical care in the US and addressed coverage issues for, I think, about 50 million people in the US in some kind of way. So both the Affordable Care Act and the National HIV/AIDS Strategy sort of worked together to expand the net for people living with and impacted by HIV. And the first strategy that came out we had a lot of concerns about it. We felt that, in reading the strategy, it was good. It was a great step forward on many different things, but it really kind of missed many specific gender issues. For example, there was no mention of violence. There was no mention of trauma. There was no mention of reproductive health care. Actually, there was one mention of reproductive health care, and it was around scaling up provision of HIV testing in our Title X clinics. Title X is what Planned Parenthood is funded by in the US. So basically, where people are getting reproductive health care, they talked about scaling up HIV testing. We were like, hey, what about people living with HIV of all genders needing reproductive health care too, right? And sexual health care. That was completely missed in the strategy, in the first one. So we monitored, we created a gender monitoring tool for the strategy based on this document that we had submitted back in July of 2009. We were like, we told you what you needed to do. Now we're going to grade your strategy based on what we said you needed to do. And so a bunch of organizations, again, came together, graded the strategy with a bunch of rationales. We gave the strategy, I think, a really generous C+, on a scale of like F, where you fail, A, where you're great. We gave it a C+, because we wanted the administration to keep working with us, but really, there were some categories that were more like a D or an F. So we released that in September 2010, and we told them where there was room for improvement. So we also continued to work with the administration on some of the specific issues. So for example, we demanded, the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS had been convened. This is sort of like a national advisory body to, ostensibly to the president, but really to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, that was kind of charged with civil society oversight of the strategy. And so we demanded a specific meeting of that body focused on women's issues. And we were able to get one. It took about 2 years, but we were able to get one and to pass a resolution at that body addressing some of the specific issues that I mentioned, such as, there needed to be a way to look at the intersections between intimate partner violence and HIV, to look at these intersections between sexual and reproductive health care and HIV. There needed to be more of a focus on trans data collection and issues for the trans community. And so we were able to get a resolution passed. We also helped pull together this event at the White House, back when we used to be willing to go in the White House, in 2015, specifically on the issue of HIV and violence against women and girls. This is one of our founding members, Vanessa Johnson, who used to work at the National Association of People with AIDS, speaking at that event. So they ended up forming a federal interagency work group focused on this intersection. So that meant they brought in, they had representatives from all the different federal agencies that were implicated in the National HIV/AIDS strategy. So our Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Labor, Prevention, Housing, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, all these different agencies were meeting regularly to talk about how to better address the intersection of HIV, violence against women and girls, and gender-related health disparities. And so that group met for several years during the Obama administration and came up with some very specific recommendations. And so when it was time for them to update the National HIV/AIDS strategy and release the update in July of 2015, because it had been a 5-year strategy, they addressed some of our issues. And so specifically, this is one example of something we wanted in there that was addressed, was improving outcomes for women in HIV care by addressing violence and trauma and factors that increase the risk of violence for women and girls living with HIV. Also, some of these non-women specific things were things that we really pushed for as well, like housing issues being addressed for people living with HIV, etc. So we put out a more favorable statement then. So our work, though, is very much not only about HIV, because as the great Audre Lorde says, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, right? And so we very much see HIV as really a focal point that shines a spotlight on lots of different broken systems in the US context. So HIV for us is not the thing to be ended. We don't use end the epidemic rhetoric in my organization. That's not actually our priority, because we don't think that ending the epidemic is actually solving the fundamental conditions that place our communities at risk in the first place for both acquiring HIV and for having poor health outcomes once diagnosed. So we're much more focused on addressing LGBTQ rights and equality, and ending criminalization in all different forms, and ensuring universal health care, and things like that. And so our policy agenda, this is our policy agenda. It's quite an intersectional agenda. I have some like complete copies of it here. If anybody is interested in one, they're like 20 pages long, so I didn't want to give them to everybody, and they're pretty, they're US specific, domestic policy specific focused. But so we basically have, kind of an extensive priority list on every one of these areas: universal health care, economic justice, sexual and reproductive health rights and justice, ending criminalization, trans rights, safety and justice, and ending violence against women living with HIV. And we look at all of these sort of in a broad way, and we also have very specific recommendations at the local, state, and federal level to address each of these things. And those recommendations shift and change, but our position doesn't shift and change on what we want to see happen. So we also do other kinds of work. We do a lot of leadership building and skills development. And so just as one example, after the 2016 election, we had already been doing leadership development work since 2008, lots of different trainings on organizing, advocacy, public speaking, skills building, how to use social media, how to submit public comments on proposals that come out of the administration. How to do legislative advocacy on like bills and congressional proposals. But we realized after the election that we needed to take a step back and kind of reorient. So after the election in 2016, it was a pretty dark day in the US. It was like that's kind of saying it very lightly. People were terrified. And on November 9th, none of us slept that night. November 9th, people were afraid to leave their homes. Our members are trans people, people of color, immigrants, a lot of different folks who had been really targeted by the occupant of the White House's rhetoric during the campaign cycle, and were terrified about the prospects of this presidency. And so at our end of year staff retreat, we get together every year. We're a national staff. We're not all based in one place. We're quite remote. So we get together a few times a year, and we always get together at the end of the year and kind of look back at what we did, learn some lessons, sort of evaluate and think about how to move forward. And we actually spent most of that staff retreat at the end of December, in December 2016, early December 2016, instead really assessing the political moment we were in, and articulating what our bottom lines were, and articulating what we were willing to do and what we were not willing to do. And we basically decided that we were going to throw down in every way we needed to resist the administration and ensure that the rights of our communities were upheld. And so one of the ways we decided to do that is to be more intentional about building a leadership bench, a deep leadership bench of people who are most impacted by HIV, who can be effective advocates at every level. And so we did a lot of other things too, but so we specifically launched a policy fellowship. It's a year-long program where we train people living with HIV, mostly virtually, because we're national and we don't have a lot of money to bring people together. So we run a year-long training program, mostly online. We have coaches who are often with allied organizations come in and sort of like coach subsets of our cohort, but we provide like 9 months of intensive curriculum to them, and then they have a 3-month practicum period where they work on a policy project. And so we're now in our 3rd year. This is our 1st year class graduating. You can see that, this is a really diverse class. This is really reflective of what the epidemic looks like in the US among women. It's not reflective of who you see at policy tables even today. And so, we're still working to change that. Some of the other things we did after the election cycle, we realized that everything was moving so quickly. Policies were moving so quickly. On his first day in office, we call him Cheeto Leany, he released like 3 executive orders that he already had ready to go, right? And that included the Muslim ban. And it included direct attacks on trans communities. And so we were like, this is moving faster than we even expected or were prepared for. And so another thing we instituted in January of 2017 was a monthly policy update. So we basically create a digest of all of the policy developments relevant to our community, and we produce it every month. And our role is to make that information accessible, because it is, and to put it into language that is meaningful to our constituency, who are not don't all have like, you know, a high level of formal education, but these issues really impact their lives. And so we produce basically a digest, and it's like, here's everything that happened in anything on healthcare policy that you need to know, anything on LGBT policy you need to know, anything on civil rights and racial justice that you need to know. Here's what they're doing on Medicaid, which is like our large low income insurance program. And then we also have a place for state-specific updates in there. So you can look at our website, you can see the archives of all of that. You could subscribe to our mailing list if you want to know about what's happening in US policy that impacts the HIV community. We're the ones who basically produce a roundup every month. And so we've been doing that, you know, since January 2017. We also, you know, have had to go all out on lots of different issues, like saving the Affordable Care Act. So that is the expansion of health insurance that that President Obama put into place, that has consistently come under attack by the Republican Party. It is actually what they ran their campaign on. It's what they ran the midterms on in 2012, was trying to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. It's also how they picked up a lot of seats in our 2014 midterm election cycle. And it is what this current administration has been trying to do since day one. And so we have, you know, many members of our team have been arrested, have gone to jail. There was one day that my board chair, my communications director, and my policy director were all like in jail, you know, protesting the attempts to dismantle the Affordable Care Act in DC. But we've had hundreds of members participate in these actions, show up at their members of Congress's offices. We've been able to save the Affordable Care Act 3 times already. As a result of that work, working in coalition with disability organizations and others. We kind of transformed the discourse from this is, you know, about some wonky policy to like, no, this is actually about people's lives and medication. You may have seen the images, people with wheelchairs, people in wheelchairs locking down inside the offices of members of Congress. The power of an image to change the discourse is pretty amazing. So this has included bird dogging folks, which means just like finding them where they are. So in airplanes, there's one friend of ours he was diagnosed with ALS. He is going to die like in the next few years. He happened to get a key member of Congress, a senator, on a flight that he was on, and he recorded the whole interaction, and it went viral all over the U.S. And you know, he basically told his story to the senator, and it galvanized a lot of action in local communities, not just by people with chronic health conditions, but people who realized how much there was to lose. And so the power of direct action and imagery and communication in helping to shape policy, I think should never be underestimated. So let's see, I'm short on time, but I was going to talk a little bit about HIV criminalization specifically. So just to give you a little bit of a context, I want to talk a little bit about HIV criminalization because it's a major issue that we contend with in addition to some of the things I just talked about. So in the US, do you have HIV criminalization laws here? You have a disclosure law, right? Okay. So we don't have a federal law, but we have laws at the state level. So there are over 30 states and US territories that have some version of a law criminalizing HIV non-disclosure, exposure, or transmission in the US. Prosecutions have occurred even when no transmission happened, and convictions have happened even when no transmission happened. This law...
In Sweden too, eh?
Pardon, in Sweden too?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to hear more about that also during the discussion. So like other parts of our criminal justice system, these laws are applied with a lot of racial disparities and gender disparities. Homophobia is a big driver in the way these laws are utilized as well. And so these laws got put onto books through a piece of legislation that was enacted in the 1990s. Which is like the Ryan White Care Act, which is basically our largest federal payer of HIV funding that goes to the states. So any state that wanted to qualify for HIV funding had to be able to show that they had the ability to prosecute people who intentionally infected. But most states went much further than that. their laws do not require you to prove any sort of like intent or actual transmission in order to be utilized. And so my point is these laws now are not, it's not federal. They have to be undone one by one at the state level. And so that there's a large movement in the US that has been working to do this, and of course globally as well. And so we have successfully reformed a couple of our laws already. We reformed a law in Iowa in 2014. We modernized the law in Colorado in 2016. And I'll talk a little bit about 2017 in a minute, where we modernized the law in California. But basically, from sort of a feminist and anti-racist perspective, it's really critically important that these laws are addressed and that women in particular take a leadership role in addressing these laws. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So, there are lots of different ways in which interventions by the state, whether it's criminalization of HIV or other things, like I've seen everywhere here, I'm seeing signs about trafficking. And, at least in the US context, we have a lot of concerns about the way that trafficking and sex work get conflated. But so these conceptions of gender really sort of shape the way the state intervenes. And often women get positioned as sort of like victims, passive victims who have to be saved by the state, usually in the form of a white man. And usually they're talking about saving white cis women. So there are these ideas of like masculinity and sort of like patriarchy that are informing how these laws are both created and applied. And so in HIV criminalization particularly, this sort of specter of like innocent victims who are usually cisgender women was really used as a tool to put these laws into place, right? So there was this idea that mostly that men were off doing something and bringing HIV home into their relationships, into their families or to their wives. And so that's actually like part of the ideology that allowed these laws to be put into place. And in fact, there are still policymakers who have proposed laws to, arguing that they will, for example, today, protect Black women from acquiring HIV. If we just have laws that would criminalize the men, we can save women, right? So hopefully people understand how problematic that is. It is really deeply problematic because, there is no such thing as an innocent victim and somebody who's guilty. Like in order to have innocence, you have to have guilt as a counterpart, right? And I think we all know that HIV, when it is committed, is usually in conditions where people either lacked some sort of access to healthcare, lacked mental health resources or support, couldn't disclose for whatever set of reasons, including homophobia, stigma, fear of criminalization itself, fear of violence. So usually lots of data bears out the fact that most people, when they know they are living with HIV, choose to take measures, really care about protecting other people from it, right? So there is no innocence or guilt here. And because women in particular have been used as this tool to impose these oppressive laws, it's really important that we are part of the solution to fix them, and that in fact that we lead the way. And so that is a lot of the work that PWN has been doing over the last few years, over the last, I would say, like 8 years or so in the US, is these laws also, by the way, the state, at least in the US, has always tried to police and control the bodies of people who are seen as other. So that has played out in the way that Black and brown women have been allowed to reproduce, during the time of, for example, during the time of slavery. Our entire economy is basically built on slavery, right? And so people were commodities, people were capital, babies were capital because they could work land. And for the indigenous people on those land, their reproduction and sexuality was also controlled. And so, and LGBTQ bodies have been policed and surveilled and controlled globally. I think we were just talking earlier that there are more than 70 countries that criminalize same-sex relations. in some kind of way, right? So when we understand that all of this policing and surveillance is really happening in a larger context, and it's very much about controlling who does what with their bodies, we can see that HIV criminalization is really just an extension of that. It is the same bodies we're talking about: queer bodies, Black and brown bodies, low-income people's bodies that are being policed, bodies of people who trade sex for whatever they might need, bodies of people who use drugs or substances, generally because they're coping with trauma, right? So these are the bodies that we're talking about policing and controlling. And so there's always, the state never does anything neutrally. There's always some sort of interest there, right? And so it's important that we interrogate that. And so for women with HIV in the US are really living at the intersection of all these different forms of oppression. And our vision as PWN is more expansive than just addressing HIV criminalization. It's really about addressing over-policing, surveillance, brutality at the hands of law enforcement, and also because people's rights get taken away in the US once you interact with the criminal justice system, people lose rights like the ability to vote, the ability to apply for loans, sometimes the ability to go to school and apply for education loans and things like that, even the ability to live in certain kinds of housing. So our focus is really on ending criminalization more broadly, with the priority towards HIV-related criminalization of sex work, and criminalization of substance use. And so what we have done is change the way that women living with HIV are positioned in HIV criminalization discourse. We've done that through a lot of political education of our own membership and training on specific skills, so that now our members around the country are helping to lead campaigns at the state level in probably about 8 or 9 states that are working to decriminalize HIV. It's a long haul. These are not one-year campaigns. These are multi-year campaigns usually to undo these laws. We are also building with intersectional movements, anti-mass incarceration movements, racial justice movements, et cetera, and making sure that the folks most impacted by these laws are really centered within the coalitions fighting to change them, because usually if you've ever done any kind of advocacy or legislative work, you know that there are moments where compromises get proposed along the way, and if you don't have the people who will be most impacted by the compromises at the table, decisions can get made that are really harmful to folks, right? And so so we have done a lot of different types of work on decriminalization issues, from support to education to sex work decriminalization to proposed. This is a bill that was proposed in 2013, a quarantine bill for people living with HIV. That's what's happening in the US. So we were able to defeat that proposal pretty quickly. So just a very quick case study so you can see how this plays out from a gender perspective. In California, we were looking to modernize our laws, and we sort of did an examination to see what was happening. I will just sort of go through this quickly. We looked at who had been impacted by criminalization laws in California itself, which is one state. It is the most populous state in the US. And it is where there are a lot of people living with HIV there. We found severe racial and gender disparities in who was being targeted by our laws. So it was approximately 900 instances of criminalization that had happened. And women represented 43% of those, even though we are only 13% of the epidemic in California. Black folks and Latinos represented 2/3 of those who had been criminalized under HIV-specific laws, even though they were about half of our epidemic in California. And so we've brought together a pretty robust coalition. This is the leadership of that coalition. It included sex work organizations. It included Black-led and Latinx-led organizations. So really bringing together some of the most impacted stakeholders. Trans folks, we didn't have any good data on how they were being targeted by these laws because law enforcement consistently misgenders people. But we do have a big issue with people being picked up for walking while trans and assumed to be doing sex work. So trans folks are already subject to over-policing independently of HIV criminalization. And so we had a whole bunch of laws we had to address in our bill. I won't go through them in detail, but I'll say we had 3 parts of the health and safety code that we needed to address, plus 3 different parts of the penal code that were all sentence enhancements. The one that most folks were getting charged under, 95% of our convictions were under this one Penal Code Section 647F, a felony enhancement for solicitation while knowingly living with HIV. This means that if you were picked up for doing sex work, whether you were actually doing sex work or not, if you were picked up for doing sex work and you had a previous HIV positive test on file, you could be charged with a felony instead of a misdemeanor. So that was a 5-year additional sentence, plus having a felony conviction, which means that you lose a lot of your rights. And so this was actually the most harmful one, and it was the one we were most focused on changing. So we put together a bill that addressed all of these. We ended up having to drop the sex offense part. That we don't think that had a ton of impact because there are actually not really any prosecutions happening under that one. But that was the part we had to drop in our final bill. But we were able to, this was like a 3-year process. We had a set of guiding principles that we followed as a coalition, and our non-negotiables on the legislative side. And this was really important because there were multiple points in the process where either the sponsors of our bill, this has to be sponsored by legislators. That's the way it works in California. It has to be sponsored by elected officials. We have a bicameral legislative body, so there's a state assembly and a state senate, and the bill has to pass both. And so there were lots of points along the way where we were asked to make different kinds of sets of compromises. So these were really important, the guiding principles and the non-negotiables. And some of these were particularly important, like no new crimes or increased penalties for any other disease. That mattered. We were actually asked to include other diseases in like a misdemeanor statute. In Iowa, when they reformed their bill, it actually ended up happening. They ended up adding reducing criminalization of HIV, but increasing criminalization for TB and Hep C. So we wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So I think because of time, I will just quickly say that we were able to pass our bill. We did it through a multi-step process. In the first couple of years, we couldn't move the whole HIV criminalization part, but we did move one specific piece, which was in the Health and Safety Code, there was a felony for organ donation while living with HIV, which was inconsistent with our federal law, which now allows organ donation from people with HIV to people with HIV. So we were able to do that. During the process of doing that, we did a lot of education of legislators about HIV, just like updating them on the science. Many of them, their perspectives on the science of HIV was stuck in the 1980s. And so they needed to know about things like U equals U and treatment as prevention and the fact that if you have a suppressed viral load, you can't transmit. So we used that all as an educating moment. And we were able to get an organ donation bill passed in 2016. After that, we did a lot more work for the next couple of years, and we ended up getting our modernization law passed in October 2017. It came down to the wire. We didn't know if it was going to be passed. It passed the Assembly and the Senate, and then we heard the governor wasn't going to sign it. If anyone has questions about that, I can talk about that more later. So we did end up eliminating the penalty. We also were able to pass a requirement for vacating previous sentences. So that's something that folks are actively working on right now. So I think because of time, I am going to end there and see if there are any questions.
I think I have some questions first,
Okay, great.
and then we'll open up for the audience after. Thank you so much this far. I guess we could have gone into detail about all the questions. You're doing a tremendous job in the PWN, I must say. I wanted to go back to specifically HIV as a feminist issue. Why is it useful to frame HIV as a feminist issue, and do you think there are any risks in doing so, like concerning political polarization or something?
Interesting. So, there are so many different forms of feminism. So I think it's complicated to think about what does it mean to actually frame HIV as a feminist issue. We frame HIV as an intersectional issue, which means that we look at it through the lens of feminism, but also racism and heterosexism and, cis heteropatriarchy and all of that. So if we really understand HIV as sort of like a consequence of all these different systems of power, and the fact that it's been allowed to become the global pandemic that it is because of those systems of power and because of capitalism and, particular like private profit interest in drug pricing and access to medication, then I think we get to start with a different set of interventions that's much more useful. And so, yes, I believe it's critically important and helpful to start with that sort of approach. That's what allows us to interrogate the systems that make people vulnerable in the first place and change those, rather than focusing on changing people's individual behavior, which is really not the point. That is often shame-based, and that is often really about somebody's ideology and morality, rather than actually wanting to address the fundamental problems.
Do you want to elaborate a bit more about the access to care? How does it look for women living with HIV in the US today?
Yeah, sure. So that is a bit complicated, but basically we don't have universal healthcare in the US still. We have a patchwork of systems that are put together to provide healthcare. We have a problem with our entire healthcare system before HIV happens, right? And women living with HIV are generally very low income, and we've had a system where people have actually been forced to be poor after HIV diagnosis in order to access services, because many of our services are income-based. So that means that you can only qualify at the state level. There's a program called the AIDS Drugs Assistance Program, ADAP. It's federally administered, but it goes through the states. And so, or federally funded, but it's administered by the states. Every state has a different income threshold that you can use to qualify for that program. In some states, that income threshold is very generous. Like in California, it's $50,000 a year. So you can have a job and be earning some money, although that's not really great to survive in California. But
Excuse me, how much?
It's $50,000 US dollars.
Okay, thanks.
So that's the most generous type of program we have, where you can still qualify for the AIDS Drugs Assistance Program. In some states, the number is more like $10,000 a year. And so nobody can survive on $10,000 a year, no matter where you are. But you're forced to be low income in order to survive. And that's because historically, our healthcare system has been tied to employment before the Affordable Care Act. So, and that's just one program. Housing programs, food programs, other types of things you might need, other types of healthcare you might need in addition to medication, you have to have a very low income in many states in order to qualify for them. And so people living with HIV, if you weren't low income before you acquired HIV, you're almost forced to be after in order to live and survive, because our healthcare system is very capitalist. And so you have to buy into it. You have to pay co-payments. Even if you have coverage, you often have to pay a co-payment to pick up your prescription, to see your doctor, to get medical tests and things like that. So yeah, about 80% of our members in PWN are living well under the federal poverty level, and many of them are also taking care of other people on whatever money they do have.
And would then many of them have chosen to do so, like stop working?
It's both. It's both. So some of them had to make that choice in order to qualify for benefits, because a lot of forms of employment don't come with healthcare. Like if you work in retail, that usually doesn't come with healthcare. If you are a domestic worker, that doesn't come with healthcare. If you work in if you work an hourly job, that often doesn't come with healthcare. So many different professions that women historically work in don't automatically come with healthcare benefits. And so there could be ways in which they either had to reduce their income to qualify or work more. And so it's sort of a catch-22. And then now that healthcare coverage has been expanded, there's more of a base for that, but it really depends on where you are, because the Affordable Care Act that President Obama passed has become such a political football that in many states, especially the Republican states in the South, they decided to opt out of taking money from the federal government to expand their Medicaid program, just in order to spite Obama, basically. And this has had consequences for millions of people in those states, which also happen to be where the largest HIV epidemic is. where Black people and Latinx people in particular are most impacted, where there are no other social services, where reproductive health care has also been systematically dismantled, basically just on the basis of ideology.
You kind of touched upon it when you talked about how PWN, you're working more intersectionally compared with working just with feminism or anti-racism. But if you would have had to focus on those two topics concerning government policies, what would you like? How do you think governments should act, or what kind of policies should they employ in order to secure that they are feminist and anti-racist?
So that's a very big question.
Yes.
But I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I think number one, we have to have a robust universal safety net, right? Like everybody should have access, no matter what your race, your ethnicity, your gender identity, your income level, your immigration status. Everybody needs access to healthcare. Everybody needs access to housing. Everybody needs access to education. Like these should just be non-negotiables, right? In a country as wealthy as the U.S. So if you start there, we already address a lot of the inequities and disparities because all of those things are disproportionately impacting women, trans people, and people of color. Specifically in the U.S. context right now, our administration has set their focus and their sights on dismantling protections for, I would say, 4 specific groups. So that includes women and anyone who can get pregnant, transgender people. There are multiple proposals in the administration right now to eliminate protections for transgender people from employment settings to healthcare settings, to make it legal to discriminate. LGBT folks in general also are a target of this administration. Many of these religious revival laws are also applying to LGBT folks. And of course, immigrants is the biggest category of folks who are being targeted by this administration. And it's not just what you might be hearing in the news about the xenophobia and things like that. It is literally policy proposals and policies that are being passed that allow, for example, now if you have an expensive health condition and you want to immigrate to the US, either to enter or to get a green card, it will be much harder. You have to prove that you have $500,000 in the bank or an equivalent of that. There's a second proposal coming also that is looking at this determination of what's called public charge, which is basically whether an immigrant is likely to present a burden on U.S. society, and much of it is connected to health issues and health status. And so I think from a feminist and anti-racist perspective, these perspectives are critically important because it is the ideas of masculinity and patriarchy that are driving the whole agenda on women, trans people, and LGBTQ folks. All of that is coming from misogyny and patriarchy and a desire to control, certain types of people's bodies. And then all of this anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy proposals is really being driven. It's undergirded by racism.
These policies under the current administration, what kind of concrete consequences do you think they would have or will have for women living with HIV in the US?
Yeah, they're already having consequences. So a number of our Planned Parenthood clinics have already shut down. Just in the last few weeks, this has already happened because the administration basically made some decisions that Planned Parenthood could not accept and still take their funding. And so that's already happening. There's already been a divestment. The public charge goes into effect on October 15th. We are very concerned about the effect that that's going to have on immigrants who are already in the U.S. living with HIV. But we've already seen a chilling effect. There's quite a bit of data. The public charge proposal was leaked before it even came out of the administration. It was leaked about 6 months before. That doesn't just happen accidentally. The administration also does that on purpose to scare people into not doing certain things. So immigrants have been dropping out of services since this administration took power, and even more since March of 2017, when that rule was first leaked. So this rule basically means it's much beyond HIV. It is if you access food stamps, our Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, if you access Medicaid or low-income health insurance program, if you have an expensive health condition, basically any of those things could be utilized as mechanisms either to not allow you to renew your immigration status and potentially be finable and deportable. And so this has already had a huge chilling effect. Immigrants have been falling out of healthcare for over 2 years now. We heard from a clinic that we work with in Houston a couple of years ago. They're like a maternal care, prenatal care clinic, and they primarily serve immigrant communities. And they were like, they had already seen like a 40% drop off in people accessing their services just a few months into this administration. And that's not because 40% less folks are getting pregnant. You know, it's they're just not coming in for care. They're handling their prenatal care on their own in their own communities.
You're painting quite a bleak image
Yes.
for the
I'm
future,
sorry.
but still, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the main, future challenges or maybe also successes in the years to come for women living with HIV in the US?
Yeah. So, I think what I would say is, yes, the situation is very bleak, and I'm sorry to be presenting you with that. I think that's just the truth. Things are really bad, and like people are literally fighting for their lives right now in the U.S. and I know in many parts of the world. I think there is hope, though. We just on the HIV front alone, we have brought the rate of new diagnoses down quite a bit. Many more folks are getting access to healthcare. This administration put out an End the Epidemic plan that had some funding attached to it that hopefully will help us to improve some of the conditions that people are living in. But I think most of all, hope comes from the people. And, in the US, folks are getting organized. It's not like what's happening in Hong Kong, which was really brilliant and super inspiring. But people are organized and mobilized and have been showing up day in and day out, to demand their rights. We have an election coming up. Folks in the US are going kind of all hands on deck on that election cycle because this is necessary to protect not only people living with HIV, but all vulnerable communities. Basically, we have to change who's in power and how power is held.
How do you think that power balance can be changed?
I think that I think electoral politics is one tool. It's not a long-term tool. It is only one side of intervention. We have to build a robust base. We have to continue base building. And so that looks like, talking to each other, having conversations with neighbors. A lot of people are feeling, and this may be here too, here as well, right? Like I know that you all are having some things happening here politically too. So there are a lot of people who are just feeling uncomfortable with what's happening and need someone to talk to about it and figure out what to do, right? So I think that there's no substitute for sort of the value of conversations, community level conversations, and political conversations, and figuring out how to take action together. Like something that's happening in the U.S. right now is there's a large group called Showing Up for Racial Justice that is white people basically organizing around racial justice issues, and they have been active for a while. They sort of emerged during the Black Lives Matter era, but their work really popped off after the 2016 election when, white folks were like, we didn't realize there was all this racism happening here. Well, some of us did, by the way, but it's great that they figured it out, and that they're trying to do something about it. And so now what they're doing is they're going door to door in communities, like they're deep canvassing. That's what we call, I don't know if you have that here, but in the US for like campaigns, not just electoral campaigns, but issue-based campaigns, you go door to door to people's doors and talk to them about the issues. And so this is white people going to other white people's doors and talking to them about race and about racism and about like where their pain is actually coming from. And trying to connect them into a larger vision. And I think it's those kinds of interventions that are really powerful and have the hope to change the world.
I'd like to open up for questions now. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. Thomas?
Yeah, I'm Thomas.
Yes.
I have a question. This is more of a legal question, perhaps. I think in one of the slides, it passed very quickly. I think it said something like knowingly transmit or knowingly infect or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Is that a correct legal term? It seems to me that there's a lot of things you can do legal, knowingly, like knowingly not inform, knowingly lie, but you cannot actually knowingly transmit or knowingly infect someone.
Yeah.
So it seems to me like this is just terminology they use to make it sound worse.
Yes.
Have people actually been, what's the word for it? Sentenced with that particular, and based on what? I mean,
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I don't remember exactly where that was on my slides, but here's what I will say. So there have been a couple of times where it's very rare. Most criminalization cases, mostly, like often there was no transmission at all. Often there was not even the possibility of transmission. And usually you can't really prove disclosure or non-disclosure too, right? So in some instances, we have chosen to keep an HIV-specific law on the books rather than remove it entirely, because that protects people with HIV from being prosecuted under a different part of the legal code. So there are also other laws that are like general communicable disease statutes that have been used to prosecute people with HIV. So those 34 states are not the only 34 states where people with HIV have been prosecuted. There have been successful prosecutions and convictions in states that have no HIV-specific law on the books. And so what we did in California, as an example, is we left an HIV-specific law on the books, but we made it as hard as we could for them to ever use it. Like, it basically cannot be used because they have to prove intent, they have to prove transmission happened, they have to prove the person knew, and there's like a page long of things that can be used as a defense. Like, I took my medicine, I tried to take my medicine, I talked to my doctor about taking my medicine. I use and the onus is entirely on the prosecution, not the defense, to prove that those conditions were not met. So that was a strategic choice that we made to make it more difficult to prosecute people with HIV rather than less. But it was a hard decision to make because it's hard to leave something specific on the books that like opens you up to prosecution, right? But we ultimately decided it was safer. Yes.
Do you think a proportional election system would help these issues a lot?
Yes.
That's the basic problem in all these issues, that actually the marginalized groups aren't getting actually the vote that they actually would get in a proportional system.
Yes, you're exactly right. So I'm sorry, what was your name?
Peter.
So what Peter's talking about is partly like our electoral college system, which is a terrible system that allocates a certain number of votes to each state that has nothing to do with, it's not proportional representation. So that's a problem. We are working on that problem in a few different ways. So we just passed a law in California that our electors, who are the people who participate for the electoral college, have to go with the popular vote. But we are also, so people are working to change that. Folks are also working to reform the Electoral College. You can imagine that there are certain people in power who do not want that change made. So it's going to be quite difficult. But there are things that are happening state by state to kind of intervene on that process. And I don't know if you've seen the movie Fahrenheit 11/9 by Michael Moore, where there's a really sort of visceral depiction of what happened at the Democratic National Convention in 2016. We have this system where basically each party chooses its representative after we've gone through this grueling election season, right? And there have been all these primary elections, and then they decide, and they're supposed to decide based on what their voters told them to do, but it was really clear in that case that they actually didn't. There were multiple states that chose to go with one nominee over the other, even though their voters had told them differently. And so that's a problem as well. Other questions or comments? It's a really good question. Yeah. One of the things that's really big in the US as a discourse and a policy problem is states' rights. So we have had this push basically since there were attempts to abolish slavery. We've had sort of like a tension between the role of the federal government and the role of states. and that's specifically connected to slavery when, there was sort of like a national decision to abolish slavery, and states were demanding that they had the rights to retain a slave-based capitalist system. And that was primarily in the South. And so what is happening around the Electoral College is quite similar to that, where states are saying, we need to have these rights.
More questions from the audience? Karin?
I have a question about your intersectional organization, but I think you're also like representing a very diverse group. Has there been like difficulties or challenges?
Like internally, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, there has.
How did you manage that?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question. So, there have been multiple different kinds of challenges. So, for example, when we chose to take on the issue of criminalization as an organization, we decided that based on our values, that's kind of where we start, is like we value human rights. We have a whole set of values that are articulated, and we went forth and decided to work on HIV criminalization. Well, some of our members then said, oh, we're so glad to know about these laws, because now we can use these to prosecute the men who infected us. And we were like, whoa, okay, I guess we have to do some political education around this. So, so we developed a whole political education program on that, and sort of, did a lot of work within our membership to move our membership. So we have, we have a membership that we take leadership from, but we also have stances that were really clear about grounded in our values. And so then we work to bring folks along and to help them understand why a certain position is being taken. And then if they choose not to align with us on the basis of that, that's okay. But this is what we stand for. And they don't get to go out and represent something else and be part of PWN. So this has also happened with on race and gender issues too. So since our very beginning, since our founding, we have been a trans-inclusive organization. Some of our founding members were transgender, and we have always been a trans-inclusive organization. That doesn't mean there hasn't been tension around that, and that some of our members didn't really understand what that meant. And so what we have had to do is we basically created a baseline training for anyone who's a leader within PWN to participate in, and it's a baseline training on trans justice, why trans justice is gender justice. That's one of the trainings we require any of our leaders to go through before they get a leadership role with the organization. Another type of issue that has come up is race. So we are a multiracial organization, but we have a really clear stance that we will always be led by and prioritize women of African descent, because they are the most impacted by the epidemic in the U.S. And so that is something that we've also had to do work around, and that we also have developed sort of like a baseline curriculum around for our members. Is we have an ongoing racial justice curriculum. We also have a Women of PWN Dismantling Racism work group that for our white members to participate in, to really understand and learn about race in a way that is not harmful to people of color within the organization. So they have a curriculum that they use. They have discussion groups. It's like every other Saturday or something. They meet virtually online, and we can direct folks to that standing group to to learn and educate themselves. And so we have, if our members or our chapters or anything like that, were to take stances that are not aligned, or to have representation that is not aligned with our principles around trans justice, racial justice, etc., they would be disaffiliated. So they basically sign on to a statement, either to be an individual leader or to become a formally affiliated chapter or anything like that, or to run any of our programs. They sign on to a statement that their work will be consistent with this. And then we would work with them if they had some problems, but if the problems can't be resolved, it's, go do your thing somewhere else, because this is who we are. Yeah. Yes.
How are the climate when you meet the politicians in the states, in different states? Because we feel now in Sweden it's more conservative, and in the United States more, of course. But how are they interested in your questions? Or are they more, we don't want to talk about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that it varies, but in general, HIV is not an issue that has a lot of resonance anywhere. even in the states where there are more people living with HIV. So even in California, it took us a lot to get this bill passed, because a lot of politicians, even though they come out of San Francisco and LA and they have ties to the HIV community and the LGBT community, like we probably have some of the most, like the highest number of gay elected officials in our California state legislature, but they still didn't really want to touch HIV as an issue. And they certainly didn't want to like touch and go all out on something like HIV criminalization as an issue that they perceived as really politically unpopular. So that remains a challenge. And, the way we work on it is we continue to show up and educate. We also build coalition with other groups. So we're not only at HIV tables, we're at reproductive justice tables, we're at broader healthcare, low-income healthcare tables, we're at housing tables. We're at tables that are, Black women's health issues, for example. So we make it harder and harder for them to ignore. And then we also show them, statistics on like, this is how many people are living with HIV in your state or in your district. And we try to work with them that way. And if all else fails, we just take over their offices. We've done that too. So during the Affordable Care Act stuff, there was a point where some of the members of Congress were like refusing to take any public meetings because they were so scared of the community. And so, we would try to get meetings with them. There's like one senator in Colorado, Cory Gardner, who's up for re-election right now, and we're getting ready to go after his seat. But he's just stopped meeting with his constituents, period, because his votes on healthcare were very unpopular, and he was so scared of the disability, HIV, and healthcare communities. And so we tried to get appointments with him multiple times. Then we ended up just doing our own intervention, and we basically live streamed a town hall with Cory Gardner, except he wasn't there. It was an empty chair. And so one of our members interviewed him and asked a bunch of questions on a Facebook live stream about healthcare. And so basically and all of our members asked questions. It was like a town hall, except that he was just an empty chair with the name Cory Gardner on it. And so we used that as a tactic and a strategy to also, kind of ramp up information about our issues and to show kind of how responsive he wasn't being. I don't know if that helps, but we use lots of different tactics, and we just take it to the public if we have to. There's a hand over here.
Yeah, I was just wondering if youngsters in the US afflicted with HIV are interested and engaged when it comes to decision making in the HIV policy in the US.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say that it is yes and no. So for one thing, in general, younger people with HIV have a lot of other stuff going on, and HIV may not be their priority, and or they really don't necessarily always want to be out there on HIV issues, which is completely understandable. That said, we do have a number of young people who are engaged and involved, and especially long-term survivors who were born with HIV or who acquired HIV very young, who are now in their 20s or 30s. There are not a lot of them, but there are some, and they've been kind of organizing and gaining visibility as well. They produced a film. Some of them produced a film recently that's a really powerful film called We're Still Here, and it's 4 stories of young people who acquired HIV perinatally or vertically and are now living with it today. But I think we have a real problem in a lot of the structures around how policy meetings even happen that are set up to really disenfranchise people, and especially young people. So we use systems that are extremely bureaucratic, like PWN doesn't, but the larger policy community. And we have these local jurisdiction level planning bodies that operate on Robert's Rules of Order, which if you are familiar with that, it's this weird parliamentary procedure where people have to know exactly the language to use if they're proposing something, know when questions can be asked. It's really designed to be basically shut people out of the process, and it particularly shuts young people out of the process. And so I would say there's still a lot of work to do on that, on creating situations that are more accessible, and also on figuring out how to involve young people with HIV in a way that is safe for them and that really honors their whole beings. but I would love to learn if you have ideas on that. Okay.
Any more questions?
You had mentioned something about the HIV criminalization situation in Sweden. I don't know if you'd be willing to say any more about that, if we have a minute or two.
They say that Sweden is one of the worst countries because we are so few people, you see, individual and procentual. Sweden sticks out, and then you could. Now it's changed, but it's just a couple of years ago, or a bit more, and you could be. In jail just for, not for transmitting, but just for not telling.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. One of the things I want to invite you all to, I've heard that before, and it's Sweden and also Canada, I think, are two of the worst in terms of rates of criminalization. So there is a global movement that you can join. HIV Justice Worldwide, if you haven't heard of it, it's a global movement to end HIV criminalization, and we would love to have you all involved. PWN is on the steering committee, but there are lots of other organizations that are in that, and you can join at this website, hivjusticeworldwide.org. Also, before the International AIDS Conferences, we do a pre-meeting for folks from around the world to get together and strategize about how to defeat these laws and get rid of them and how to work with each other and best practices. And so because we won't be in the San Francisco conference because of all the problems with having an international conference in San Francisco, we will be hosting that meeting for 2020 in Mexico City. And we would love to have you all there from Sweden. And there will be scholarships available.
In Sweden, we haven't changed the writing. It's just a policy or how you what you do with the text. I mean, so now it's a couple of years ago, so nobody has been
criminalized.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. I saw in the new.
But it's the same text. I mean, we haven't changed the laws.
Yeah.
It's we've done it from a back way. I mean,
yeah.
Doing that. It's the medics that have the responsibility, and he can take away the information duty.
I saw that because I looked at your new patient information sheet, and it was very interesting. I saw that they've removed the requirement to use a condom, but now they've made it like where your medical provider basically gets to decide if you're a risk. So that seems a little concerning. It leaves a lot of power in the hands of these providers, and it would be great to figure out how to actually change that. So
and it's like 70% that haven't talked to their doctor about that. So no, it doesn't work all the way.
Yeah.
But it's changed and the policy changed.
Thank you for flagging that.
Question here?
Couple hands, yeah.
Oh, I just have this controversy about the next AIDS conference in San Francisco. So how come this is big controversy? Is that because of that some people cannot go to the US because they will not be allowed to enter, or what is it? Is there anything else?
It's so many things, but yeah. So for some context, I live in Oakland, which is 20 minutes from San Francisco, and we are not going to the San Francisco conference. We're going to the Mexico conference. There have been problems with hosting the conference in the U.S. for years already because we have a travel ban on sex workers and we have a travel ban on people who use drugs. Those were in place before this administration. Now with this administration, we also have a Muslim ban on 7 countries. We have a ban on Venezuela. We also have this new public charge rule that I just told you about, where people entering the U.S. have to be able to show that they won't become a burden on society. We think that could be a problem to people with HIV entering. We also have the U.S. Customs and Immigration Enforcement is now requiring 5 years of social media handles from visa applicants. This is a new development. So things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse by the month in terms of who will be able to enter the U.S. We have been asking IAS to revisit this conversation for this decision for 2 years before they even announced it publicly. We were asked to sign on to endorse the bid for the conference coming to San Francisco. every single PLHIV network in the US declined. GNP Plus and ICW have now pulled out of the San Francisco conference as of last week, and they have said they're going to be in Mexico. All of the key population groups, the International Network of People Who Use Drugs, the Global Network of Sex Work Projects, are working on the Mexico conference, not the San Francisco conference. Also, there is a problem in the way that IAS has not chosen to consult with communities about these decisions before they're made. And so I could go on and on and on. But so basically, we are asking, the Eastern European PLHIV networks are calling for a boycott of the conference. We haven't exactly called for a boycott yet, but we've declined to participate. And we're really concerned that transgender people won't be able to enter also. And all of the other populations that I just mentioned. So we don't think it's safe for people to try to come. There's also an issue where if you're declined for a visa by the US, that can impact potential visas for other countries. So we're really worried that people don't even understand the consequences potentially of applying for a visa, let alone coming. Not to mention that we're having an outburst of vigilante violence all over the US right now, white supremacist violence, lots of different things happening, anti-LGBT violence. San Francisco is relatively safer, but it also happens to be the most expensive city in the country, if not one of the most expensive cities in the world. So it's also inaccessible to most of, even our people in the US cannot afford to come to San Francisco and stay there for a week. So for a variety of reasons, I would invite you to join us in Mexico City in July 2020. It's going to be so much better. That conference is being organized by key population groups. The research also will be prioritizing community-based research and community-informed research on key populations.
We're running out of time. We have one question. You haven't asked any questions yet?
It's not actually a question, but I just want to say congratulations because you've done so much with all the challenges that you had to face to create what you've created. So really good kudos to you guys.
Thank you. I will take that back to our folks. We have the most badass members. Thank you.
One short question from Thomas, and then we'll wrap up.
I apologize if I missed something in your presentation. I lost my voice today. Aging with HIV is one of the major. Well, we're all getting older, and luckily most of us have medication. I know that that's not necessarily the case in your country, but is this also an issue, and do people in your group worry aging with HIV?
Yes. Thank you for raising that. So, absolutely. And also, I don't want to mischaracterize the situation. Many people do have the ability to get treatment, but the problem is the wraparound care that it takes to take your treatment. That's the bigger problem. Is most people can get the actual HIV medications, but it's that transportation is a problem, the healthcare is a problem, and all of that to get there. So. Or they don't have the money to pay for the copay on the treatment. So in terms of aging, this is a huge concern. I think the statistic is by the year 2020, more than half of people living with HIV in the US will be over the age of 55 or something like that. So we do have an aging population. It is of huge concern across communities. And so there are some really great, there are a lot of really great projects that are happening on that. We have a long-term survivors network. That is one of our things, not PWN, but there's another network of people living with HIV who are long-term survivors. We collaborate with them quite a bit through a formation called the US People Living with HIV Caucus. We also see that the issues for people who are aging are not just medical, although medical is a big issue, but it's psychosocial. There's a lot of isolation. There's a lot of trauma. There's depression. The rates of suicide actually have been, devastatingly high in some cities like San Francisco. And the rates of substance use and kind of comorbidities related to substance use have also been really high. So when we look at what's actually happening, who's actually dying from HIV and how, what we say mostly is that people are not dying from HIV, they're dying from trauma, and they're dying from depression, and they're dying from isolation, and we have a lot of work to do on that. and especially for some of the like older gay men who are really isolated, because much of their community has been lost over the years due to the epidemic. There's a real lack of sort of like support systems and infrastructure to take care of them. And I think as HIV has become more biomedicalized, we've seen a reduction in in the resources for those kinds of services being available. So that's a really big problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I will
Thank you.
use the same words as Bridget. Thank you very much for the great work that you're doing in the
Thank you so
PWN.
much.
And thank you so much for coming here and sharing your knowledge. I hope you will ask more questions in the fika break. So the fika will be out there and to the right. And we can have fika until like 4, and then we have to get up. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.